What's going on, folks? Welcome to Study Hall. If it's your first time here, my name is Philip Godfrey. If you're returning, welcome back, Bible study family. Thank you all so much for joining. And so, Study Hall is a Bible study that's built off of the scriptures in Matthew 6:33, where the Messiah tells us to seek ye first the kingdom of the Father and his righteousness, and all things shall be added unto you. So, we gather together to do just that, to see, seek, and serve the kingdom of the Father. All right. And so today we'll be continuing our study series entitled From Creation to Revelation, where we're walking through the entirety of the Bible book by book and chapter by chapter this year. Today we'll be finishing up the book of Acts. This is part 4, where we'll be looking at chapters 21 through 28 of the book of Acts. All right, so let's go ahead and jump in. As we ended in chapter 20 on the previous study, we saw Paul speaking with the believers in Ephesus about how they would no longer see him, about how he was going to Jerusalem, not knowing what all awaited him there, even though he had received some revelation from the Spirit about what kind of things would await would he would have to go through. And as the chapter ended, we see the people of Ephesus, they are weeping and kind of emotional with Paul, and they walk with him to the ship as he departs, and he gets on and sails away. This is where we pick up in chapter 21, where we have Paul sailing to various locations. One location includes Tyre, where he stays there for a week with the believers, and some of those believers there tell Paul by the Spirit not to go to Jerusalem. So they're echoing a little bit of the sentiment that the Ephesians, the church, the people of Ephesus, had already spoken to him prior to him leaving on the ship, and we saw in chapter 20. From Tyre, he then sails to Ptolemais, and then he sails to Caesarea. And once he arrives in Caesarea, he goes and stays in the house of Philip the evangelist. So it is believed that this is the same Philip who had the encounter with the Ethiopian eunuch that we studied previously. And while he was staying there was a prophet that came to visit named Agabus. And so this prophet comes, and the prophet takes Paul's girdle, binds his own hands and feet with Paul's girdle, and then he says that the Holy Spirit has revealed to him that whoever's girdle this was, that the Jews at Jerusalem were going to bind him in the same way and give him over to the Gentiles. So we see now that Paul has heard at least twice, preferably probably more than that, about warnings about going to Jerusalem and what things were going to await him with the Jews as he goes there. But Paul hears what the prophet has says, and then and the people ask him not to go, but he responds and he tells them that not only is he ready to be bound, but also to die at Jerusalem for the name of the Messiah, if that is what he needs to do. And to me, this really is similar to what we saw with the Messiah praying, "Not my will, but your will be done" in the garden. All right, and so I'm not saying that Paul is the Messiah. I'm just showing similarities. All right. So Paul from here, he departs, he goes into Jerusalem. The elders and believers, they receive Paul as he gets there, and then he goes into them and tells them all the things that the Father had done among the Gentiles through his ministry. It says that they hear it and are glorified of the Father. But James pulls Paul aside and informs him that some of the Jews have heard that he's teaching the people abroad, teaching the Jews abroad to forsake the law of Moses. And frankly, they don't like that. And so James gives him instruction to go and participate in a purification ritual that was coming up within the next day or two, so that the Jews would then believe that Paul cared about the law, and he believed the law, and he thought it was important to keep the law. So Paul does just that. The next day, he purifies himself. He enters into the temple with these other men who were taking this purification ritual. And when the time was ended of that ritual, the purification process, it says that some of the Jews from Asia, these were the Jews that we saw previously, did not like Paul and what he was doing. But some of these Jews from Asia saw Paul in the temple, and then they stirred the people up to take Paul, which the people do. And so after this, they have Paul kind of in custody, for lack of better words, and they begin decreeing that Paul has polluted the holy place through his teachings and who he was teaching to, basically saying that what he was teaching was not aligning with the text, with the scriptures, and he shouldn't have been teaching it to the Gentiles as well. So the next day, the no, while they're still there, there's like this big kind of riot going on or whatever. The chief captain hears all this noise. He goes down. He gets Paul. He puts Paul in chains, and then he asks the people, the Jews and the chief priests and whatnot, what was going on. They couldn't get their story straight, and the captain couldn't really understand what the real issue was. So he sends Paul into the castle to kind of stay as a prisoner there for a second. Um, and while on the way, Paul asked the captain if he could speak to the people, which he allows him to do. So Paul begins addressing this crowd in Hebrew, which causes them to quiet down and actually begin to listen to him because he's addressing them in the language that they are familiar with, right? And so Paul begins in chapter 22. He begins to tell the crowd about his background. He tells them that he's a Jew born in Tarsus, that he was brought up learning from Gamaliel, like Gamaliel, one of his teachers or mentors, I guess. Let's say teacher. He explains how he was taught according to the perfect manner of the law and how he was zealous for the Father just like they were. And something that I know I lose a lot as I've studied this story is the fact that Paul was one of these people. Like they were aligned at one point. They were working together at one point, and now they don't like Paul. So he's basically telling him, like, hey, just like you are, just like you're zealous for the Father, I was as well. He goes on to share how he was so zealous that he even persecuted the people who believed unto death. He even got letters from the chief priest to go to Damascus and take the believers out of their homes and bring them back as prisoners. But he tells them that while he was headed to Damascus, he has this experience where the Messiah visited him, and that experience, he had this encounter with the Messiah, and it left him blind. Um, but his eyes were open when Ananias came and met with him. And so he shares how Ananias told him that the Father had chosen him, Paul, to be a witness unto all men of what he has seen and heard. He goes on to tell him how he would go. Paul goes on to tell the crowd here how he would go to Jerusalem at first, but even while he was there, he was hesitant, because the people knew who he was. They knew that he had persecuted the believers before, and how he stood by and watched. They knew that he stood by and watched and approved of Stephen's death. But the Messiah responds to Paul and tells him to leave because he was sending him to the Gentiles. That's what Paul tells the people. And so when the people hear that these Jews were not accepting of the fact that the Gentiles, that the promises could be made available to the Gentiles. And so when they hear that Paul allegedly, that the Messiah has told Paul that he was going to send him to the Gentiles, they stopped listening to the story, or they stopped listening to what he was sharing, and then began shouting that Paul should be killed. From there, Paul tells the centurion that he's a Roman, which causes them to fear, and then because of how they had handled him. And the next day, the captain sets Paul in front of the Jewish leaders, the high council, so that he, the captain, could understand what the issue was really about. And he brings Paul into this meeting as well. When we enter into chapter 23, we then see Paul standing before the council, and he starts by stating that he has lived in good conscience before the Father. For some reason, this upsets the high priest Ananias, who tells someone near Paul to smack him in the mouth. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what happened. Paul then he smacks him, and then Paul then goes on and rebukes Ananias, but he apologizes when he realizes that he was the high priest, because he says it is written that thou shalt not speak evil of the ruler of thy people. So Paul is in this council. He realizes that there are both Pharisees and Sadducees there. So he tries to, like, I don't want to say he tries to, but he discerns this, and so he uses it to his advantage, is what I was saying. He tells the people that he's a Pharisee, that he's the son of a Pharisee, and that the reason that the people are upset with him, the Jews are upset with him, was regarding the hope and resurrection of the dead. Well, this now sets the Pharisees and the Sadducees at odds, because the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection or the angel or the spirit. This is interesting to me, because now we have believers who don't believe in resurrection or angel or spirit, and this is what the Sadducees didn't believe. But the Pharisees do believe these things. So now the Pharisees and Sadducees are arguing, not really focused. The argument is no longer focused directly on Paul, right? And so the Pharisees end up siding with Paul and said that they find no evil in him, but the two sides continue arguing. And it got so bad that the captain tells soldiers to go down and get Paul from the people, because he thought that they were going to hurt him. He thought that they were going to pull him apart. Well, that night while Paul is still in custody with the captain, it says that the Lord came and stood by Paul and told him to be of good cheer. He has testified of him in Jerusalem and also must also testify of him in Rome. So we see here that even with everything that Paul is going through in Jerusalem, even with the trials and being falsely accused and all those things, that there's still purpose in it, right? And that the Father is still using it for His plan and bigger plan, purpose, and will to come to pass. The chapter 23 then goes on to tell us about a group of Jews who, after this interaction with the high council, they made an oath and a curse that they were not going to eat or drink anything until they killed Paul. So we see here an oath likened to a curse or aligned with a curse, but also that there can be fasting for the wrong outcomes. We see here a fasting for a demonic outcome. They are deciding, making a conscious decision, entering into a covenant that they are not going to eat. They're going to fast until the Paul is dead. Paul's nephew hears about this and he goes and tells the captain. The captain then sends Paul into Caesarea with a small army for protection to Felix, the governor of that region. And he explains to Felix what's going on in the letter and tells him that the accusers, that he's told the accusers to come down and bring all these things before Felix, just like they brought them before him. Felix receives Paul and places him in Herod's judgment hall, so places him in some level of captivity as well. One thing that I always think about as we get to this part of the story is what happened to those men who made that curse, who made that oath, who were fasting for Paul's death when he was taken away. Did they die or did they eat and just break the oath? It's just interesting to me. I don't know if it's documented somewhere, but yeah, I just always think about that. So now he's in Caesarea with Felix, right? And so after 5 days, it says in chapter 24, the high priest and their group, they come down and they bring Tertullus, who's like basically like their lawyer in this situation. And they begin to explain to Felix what happened with Paul, accusing Paul of being a troublemaker, of starting riots, of creating uproars among the Jews all over the world. Tertullus also says that Paul is a ringleader of a sect of the Nazarenes. So it's interesting to me here that the language is not using the language of Christian, not identifying Paul as a Christian. But he's saying that he's a ringleader of a sect, so a group of the Nazarenes that have profaned the temple. So again, accusing him of profaning the temple. So after he's done, Paul speaks and tells Felix how, he was only in Jerusalem like 12 days ago. He's been here 5 days. It was only a week, and they didn't even find him in the temple doing anything. And ultimately, they can't prove these things these accusations they're bringing against him. Paul does go on to share with Felix and tell him that after the way, so Paul doesn't identify himself as a Christian in this conversation either, which is interesting to me. But after the way that they call heresy, so Paul says that he's following the way, a way, and these Jews would call that way that he's following heresy, right? But after this way, he says that he worships the Father, believing all things in the law and the prophets, and having hope toward the Father that there will be a resurrection of the dead, both the just and the unjust. Felix hears everything and then he couldn't really decide what was actually going on. So he just pushes it off and says that he's going to wait till the chief captain comes and then he'll hear more about the situation. So Paul goes back into captivity, but this time Felix, the governor, does allow him to have some liberty and allow him to have visitors as well. Felix calls Paul over the course of time. Felix calls Paul a few more times before him to hear him teach and to reason with him. But ultimately, what the text tells us that Felix was hoping that Paul would give him some money so that he could release him. But Paul doesn't do that. So after 2 years of this, so now Paul has been in jail in Caesarea for 2 years, and I wonder what happened to those people because he's still alive. So I wonder, did they just die of starvation? They probably just ate. But anyway, these are how I think about stuff. But after 2 years, Felix is now out as governor, and there's a new governor that comes in named Festus. But before Felix leaves, he didn't let Paul go because the text says that he wanted to keep the Jews happy. So Paul is still in captivity in prison for at least at that point 2 years or so, and while Festus is there. Well, Festus is there, and so the Jews then asked Festus to send Paul to Jerusalem so that they could judge him there. But secretly, what they were doing was plotting to kill him in transit. Probably these same people who vowed that they weren't going to eat or drink. Anyway, but Festus tells them that Paul is going to stay at Caesarea, and if they have issue with Paul, then they can bring it before him there. So Festus gets back to Caesarea. He calls Paul in. The Jews come in, and they brought their accusations against him again. Paul continues to deny the claims, as we know that they are false. Festus, he wants to do, according to the text, he wants to do a favor for the Jews. And so he asked Paul if Paul would go up to Jerusalem and be judged about these things before him there. Well, Paul refuses. He's like, hey, I've already been to Jerusalem. You are the one that should be judging me. I should be judged here. And so Paul appeals to Caesar, who is basically like Festus's boss. So he's like, let me talk to the manager, essentially. So Festus says, fine. He agrees that he was going to send him to Caesar. And there's a period of time before that happens. So during that period of time, after this, another king comes to visit in Caesarea, King Agrippa, with his wife Bernice. And so Festus tells them what's going on with Paul, and then they want to hear from Paul. So Paul is brought before Festus, Agrippa, and some of the other captains and whatnot. Paul then shares with Agrippa what has happened. He begins to tell him the same story that he told I call it on the steps in Jerusalem, right? Before the chief captain. He tells him how he about his youth and how he grew up as a Pharisee, and how now he has aligned to the Father in the hope of the promise that the Father made to their ancestors. He talks about how the thing that he's been accused of by the Jews is that the Father will raise them from the dead. He tells them how he once persecuted these believers and even was given the go-ahead to do so by the chief priests, who are now persecuting him. But when he was on the road to Damascus, he had an encounter with the Messiah, and how the Messiah sent him to the Gentiles to bring the message to them. And these are all the things that the Jews want to kill him about. So Festus hears all of this, and he says that Paul is crazy because he's like, no one's trying to kill you. Well, we know on the back end, we got inside information that they've been trying to kill Paul since the day that he had that Damascus Road experience, essentially. So Agrippa responds and says that Paul almost persuaded him to be a Christian, and Paul also never identified himself as a Christian. I just think it's interesting. Don't read into it. I just think it's interesting. He says to Agrippa, he says, I would to the Father that not only thou, but all of those that hear me this day were altogether such as I am, except these bonds. So he's like, yeah, I want you to be like I am. I want you to believe like I'm believing. I'm doing all of this because I want to share with you the things that have been revealed to me and the things that have happened to me, so that you can align yourself properly. And so I want you to do that, except for these chains that you got me in. After all of this, the leaders get up, they leave, and they debrief, and they come to the conclusion that there really is no reason for Paul to die or even to be in prison. Agrippa, who's the new king coming into the situation, he goes even further and says that Paul may have been released if he had not appealed to Caesar, which we know is not true, right? We know how people say, well, if he hadn't done that, then it would never happen. Well, we don't know, but we know that that's not true. They still would have found a way to keep him bound or have him killed in Jerusalem. And we know it's not the Father's will. He has to go to Rome. So in chapter 27, we see that Paul is sent with other prisoners to Rome. And I'm summarizing all of this, so please go back and read and study it yourself. But Paul is sent with some other prisoners to Rome. There are about 200 of them or so. And they had some trouble with the sailing. Perhaps by my reading it seems like it was because of the time of the year. But anyway, they end up shipwrecking on this island that they weren't really familiar with. And so another reason, which I think is cool, one of the reasons that they shipwreck instead of dying at sea is because Paul was with them, and the Father told him that he must be brought before Caesar. So that goes to show you that even sometimes what's going on around us, that there is even a saving grace in the middle of that thing. Like the fact that their lives looked over the way this talks about this storm, right? This was a serious storm. I'm not saying this, but I would liken it to like a hurricane type storm, like a windstorm at sea. And so they are dealing with that, and in the middle of it, probably thinking that they're going to die. The promise is saving them because the Father requires that Paul go to Caesarea and go to Caesar in Rome to visit him there. So I just think that's cool. As moving to chapter 28, the people on the island that they land on, they were described by the writer as barbarous, but were very kind to them. So um, it says that they built a fire for them. They helped them kind of with the things that they need, and it goes on to tell us a story. The writer goes on to tell us a story about how when they had built this fire, and Paul was gathering sticks to place them on the fire. And a viper, when he put the sticks on the fire, a snake came out of the fire and bit him, and he just shook it off his hand, and it fell into the fire, and he was not harmed. When the locals saw that he wasn't harmed, they then began to say that he was a lowercase g God. From here, we then see Paul ministering even on this island under these conditions. So let's think about this. Paul is wrongly imprisoned. He has been wrongly shipped to a new location because the leaders wouldn't stand up and actually make the right judgment before the people. They were more afraid of the people. So he has also been shipwrecked. He's also been in a storm at sea. He has just gotten bitten by a snake, and he's still ministering and serving the people of this island who they consider barbarians. The mindset of ministry, like the mindset of service, like this was oozing from Paul's nature. This was his nature. Anyway, so he goes on and he still ministering to the people. He heals the chief man of the island's father. And once this was done, it says that they brought others from the island with diseases to him, and they were healed. These people that they brought to him were healed. And when it was time to go after about 3 months or so, according to the text, the people there, they made sure they were pleasant with them. They were pleasant with Paul and these inmates and these guards and whatnot. They made sure that they had what they needed for the journey. So now they get on the boat or another boat or whatever. They get into the sea, and they end up in Rome after a period of time. The centurion brought all the other prisoners and handed them over to the captain. But Paul he let dwell by himself under soldier guard. It says here that after 3 days, Paul is now in Rome. After 3 days, the scripture says that Paul calls the chief Jews of Rome together, and he talks to them, and he tells them that even though he hasn't committed any crime against them, that he's been delivered here as a prisoner from Jerusalem to Rome. Well, they tell him that they haven't heard anything about this. So basically, like the Jews in Jerusalem, according to how the Jews in Rome said it, they were kind of acting rogue, where this wasn't an agreement by all the Jews of that area, all the Jews in totality. This was agreement of those Jews in Jerusalem who had an issue with Paul, because the Jews in Rome said that they didn't hear anything about it, that no one had written to them to tell them about these things. And so then they come again, they bring a group of the Jews and believers to Paul the next day. And Paul sits with them and he teaches them of the kingdom. He persuades them concerning the Messiah. And the text says that he did so. He did this both by explaining to them the law and the prophets. And it says that some of them believed, some of these Jews believed, and some of them did not. And the scripture goes on to tell us that Paul was reminded of what Isaiah said, that some will hear and not understand, and see and not perceive. For their hearts are waxed gross, and their ears dull, and eyes closed. So these Jews had fit that description. These Jews, they heard, but they didn't understand. And this is something that we are still wrestling with today as we go out and share the good news of the Messiah and the kingdom, is that there are those who will hear and not understand because their hearts have become cold. Their hearts have become hard. And so we need to continually pray that our hearts be softened, that our hearts be open and available for what the Father is doing. And so Paul then tells them that salvation of the Messiah has been sent to the Gentiles, and that the Gentiles will hear it because the Jews have refused it. The Jews hear this, and then they leave and they reason among themselves as they are going away and going forward. And as the book of Acts ends, we see that Paul dwells in his own house, even though he's under captivity in prison. He's dwelling in his own house for 2 years, and people come to him, and he continues to preach the kingdom and teach them regarding the Messiah, full of confidence, and no one stopping him. That this was the nature of Paul, that his nature was to minister and serve and to complete the assignment with joy, right? We see that. So thank you guys so much for joining. That's the book of Acts. If you want to catch some of the previous studies, they're on my page in a playlist entitled From Creation to Revelation. You can go catch the previous Acts studies or go catch any of the previous studies from the book of Genesis. On our next study, we'll be looking at the entirety of the book of Romans. But I love you, and more importantly than me loving you, though, the Father loves you. Let him love you, okay? Start before you're ready, and don't stop. I'll see you guys next time.